I stole from a museum. I was 7 or 8 years old when I committed one of the strangest acts of my childhood. I stole a piece of ancient history from a museum. Even today, that sentence sounds surreal to me. What child shoplifts candy or a cheap toy? Sure, that happens all the time, but an actual artifact from ancient Egypt. It feels like a plot from a novel, yet it really happened, and I lived with the consequences for over 2 decades. It all began on a school trip to a local museum that was hosting a special ancient Egypt exhibit. Normally, field trips meant riding a bus with my classmates, giggling and trading snacks on the way, and then being herded through galleries or exhibits with strict instructions. Look with your eyes, not your hands. This trip was no different. Our teacher reminded us to keep our voices down in the museum, to respect the docents and staff, and above all, not to touch anything we weren't allowed to. We were second or third graders at the time, old enough to follow instructions, but still young enough to get caught up in a whirlwind of excitement when something truly extraordinary happened. And something extraordinary did happen that day. After we spent some time peeking at glass cases filled with ornate sarcophagi, battered pottery, and intricate jewelry, a staff member announced a special treat. A select handful of small relics had been approved for hands-on examination. They would be passed around in a circle so each child could hold them briefly. Even as a kid, I understood this was a rare privilege. Museums usually keep relics locked behind glass, far from grubby little hands. Yet here we were, about to touch pieces of history that were thousands of years old. The thrill was palpable in the group. I vividly recall the setup. We arranged ourselves in a wide circle on the floor, and a museum staffer, flanked by a couple of other employees and our teacher, carefully handed out the items. One of them was a small figurine of a goddess with a hippo head. Later on, I learned that this was probably an image of Taret, an Egyptian deity associated with childbirth and protection. But back then, I only saw a fascinating greenish-blue object shaped like a small, hippo-headed woman. It might have been faience, an Egyptian ceramic known for its striking glaze, or maybe a type of stone. Honestly, I was too young to know the difference. All I could see was how the figurine seemed to glow with an otherworldly hue, as though it were alive with ancient magic. When it landed in my hands, time seemed to slow. The texture was slightly rough, but in some places, the glaze or finish felt smooth. The details of the hippo's face, the body's curves, the faint markings across the surface, it was mesmerizing. I remember holding my breath, thinking that I was connected to a world so distant that I could barely fathom it. My classmates were equally entranced, but in a more general way, someone would exclaim, "Wow, this is cool," before passing it on. For me, it was deeper. I felt an instant attachment, like this figurine called out to me. It was beautiful, mysterious, and somehow comforting to hold. Then, without thinking, I made a spur-of-the-moment decision that would haunt me for years. I slipped it into my pocket. Maybe it was a desire to keep that sense of wonder for myself. Maybe I was just a kid acting on impulse, attracted to something shiny and exotic. In that flash of a second, I didn't weigh the moral or legal ramifications. It was just a gut-level reaction. I want this. Oh, I took it. The rest of the day was a blur. As we walked through the remaining parts of the exhibit, I could feel the figurine's weight in my pocket. I was both exhilarated and nervous. What if someone noticed the bulge in my clothes? What if the museum staff realized it was missing immediately and inspected us one by one? But none of that happened. I managed to walk out of the museum, board the bus, and return to school with the artifact still in my possession. Once we got back to the classroom, my heart was pounding, but I tried to appear calm. No alarms were raised yet. No one seemed to suspect me. I felt a strange mix of triumph and fear. I vividly recall sitting at my desk, pretending to read or do a worksheet, all the while thinking, I have a real ancient Egyptian artifact in my pocket. It felt surreal, almost like being in a secret spy mission. When I got home, I rushed to my bedroom and took out the figurine. I examined it under the light, turning it this way and that, noticing the subtle shifts in color. In my child's imagination, I wondered if it held magical powers. Could it grant wishes, protect me from nightmares, or transport me back in time? I made it walk around my desk, concocting little stories about it. None of this felt wrong at the time. It felt exciting, like a secret toy that was more special than anything I owned. I had no full grasp of what an artifact truly meant, beyond the fact that it was old and from Egypt. The following days passed without incident. Then, probably less than a week later, the school called an assembly. We all filed into the auditorium, whispering and wondering what was happening. Our teachers looked stern. One of them stepped up to the microphone and explained in a serious tone that a piece from the museum was missing. It wasn't a replica, the teacher stressed, but a genuine artifact that had considerable historical value. The museum was extremely upset and had asked for the school's help in recovering it. They believed someone in our group had accidentally or intentionally taken it. Suddenly, the figurine in my backpack, or my bedroom drawer at that point, felt like a burning coal. My cheeks got hot, my stomach twisted in knots. This was real. This was serious. The teacher went on about how the museum might have to contact law enforcement if the item wasn't returned. My heart pounded as I thought, law enforcement, police. At that age, my only reference points for police action were cartoons and stories. The idea that I, a quiet, well-behaved student, might be caught for theft was terrifying. After that assembly, there were more. Day after day, the school kept the pressure on. Teachers reminded us to look in our desks, our bags, our homes. Maybe someone took the artifact by mistake. Maybe it got lost in the shuffle. I remember seeing the anxious faces of some of my classmates, while others seemed completely uninterested. Then there were letters sent home to parents, urging them to question their children. My parents did ask me if I knew anything about it. I lied and said no. For a moment, I considered coming clean. I wasn't a hardened criminal. I was a child in over my head. But each time I imagined handing it over, my mind conjured terrifying scenarios. Being scolded by the principal in front of everyone, having police show up at our door, or worse, being taken to juvenile detention. Even though that was probably not a realistic outcome, my imagination and then there was the issue of how disappointed my parents would be. They always emphasized honesty and kindness, so this would be a major blow to them. I wasn't ready to face that. Weeks turned into months, and the museum's search intensified, then eventually slowed. There were rumors that the museum staff had demanded extra measures, like searching lockers or checking student belongings more thoroughly. But I don't recall any formal searches happening. Perhaps they realized it was unlikely they'd find it unless someone confessed. Over time, the assemblies about the missing artifact tapered off. The staff had other events to organize and other priorities to focus on. The matter wasn't completely forgotten, but it no longer dominated our school days. Meanwhile, I still had the figurine hidden in my bedroom. Every time I saw it, a pang of guilt coursed through me. Initially, it had been a source of fascination and excitement, but now it felt like a dark secret. I stopped playing with it as I realized it was no mere trinket. If I ever held it, I did so quietly, almost reverently, pondering whether I should slip it back to the museum. But by then, I was too scared. The museum staff seemed angry, as did the school administrators. If they found out I was the culprit, I might be labeled a criminal, or so I believed. As I moved into middle school and high school, life rolled on with new challenges. Homework, friendships, teenage angst. But in the back of my mind, I never forgot about that figurine. It stayed tucked away, sometimes in a drawer, sometimes in a small box. I'd occasionally take it out just to remind myself it was real. I was old enough to understand the gravity. I had stolen a genuine ancient artifact. My teenage conscience weighed heavily, but fear and inertia kept me silent. Once in a while, an article about stolen artifacts or museum theft would pop up in the news, and I'd read it with a racing heart, imagining how that might have been me if circumstances were different. I'd see stories about people returning artifacts to museums, sometimes decades later, and a small voice inside me would whisper, "You should do that." But the idea of stepping forward, even anonymously, made my stomach churn. After all, what if they traced it back to me somehow? By that time, our family had moved houses, and I feared I'd have to explain how it ended up in my possession for so long. I carried that moral burden into my early 20s. When I went off to college, I left most of my childhood things at my parents' house. The figurine was among them, wrapped in a cloth and kept in a shoebox. It seemed too strange to bring it with me to a dorm. Every time I visited home for the holidays, I'd rummage through my old stuff, see the figurine, and feel a jolt of guilt. I'd think about how it rightfully belonged behind glass, studied by experts, or displayed for the public to appreciate. But again, I couldn't muster the courage to do anything about it. As the years wore on, the voice of guilt never truly disappeared. If anything, it got more articulate. I'd think, "You're an adult now. You know better. It's time to fix this." But I'd always find some excuse. Maybe I was busy, Or maybe I was still clinging to the irrational fear that the museum would press charges. Rationally, I knew that if I gave it back anonymously, the odds of a full-blown investigation were slim, especially after so many years. But old fears die hard, and part of me felt it was simpler just to let sleeping dogs lie. Then, at age 31, I hit a breaking point. Call it a moral reckoning or a pang of conscience, but something inside me said, you can't keep an ancient Egyptian artifact locked up out of fear. It's not yours. It belongs to history. That's when I mustered the courage to post my confession online, under a veil of anonymity. I expected harsh judgment, and to be fair, some people were appalled at what I'd done. Others were surprisingly understanding, treating it as a childhood mistake that got out of hand. But the consensus was clear. I had to return it. That moral weight had lingered too long, and it was time to set things right. Emboldened by the collective push from strangers on the internet, I decided on a plan for returning the figurine. The key points were, protect myself from any potential legal blowback, ensure the artifact actually got to the right place, and do it as discreetly as possible. I chose a city a few hours away, far enough that if I mailed something from there, it wouldn't easily link back to me. I acquired a plain cardboard box, some bubble wrap, and a padded envelope. I wrote a short note on a piece of paper, explaining that this was an authentic ancient piece that belonged in the museum. I didn't sign it, nor did I provide any details about its history with me. The actual act of packing the figurine was nerve-wracking. I handled it gently, feeling the same textures I remembered as a child. Despite everything, there was a lingering tenderness in how I placed it in the box, as though I was saying goodbye to a friend I'd known for years. I wrote a succinct message. This item is an ancient Egyptian artifact. It belongs in your museum collection. I am returning it anonymously. Then I sealed the box, wrote the museum's address, and headed out. When I dropped it off at a mail center, my heart pounded. It seemed silly. People mail packages every day. But for me, this package represented over 2 decades of guilt. I handed it to the clerk, paid for shipping, and walked away feeling both terrified and relieved. Terrified that maybe the museum would still try to find me, and relieved that I had finally done what I should have done years ago. It felt like a major life milestone, a moral victory of sorts. So the days that followed were a mixed bag of emotions. Part of me felt an enormous sense of liberation. The figurine was no longer in my possession, which meant I no longer bore the guilt of keeping it. On the other hand, I worried. What if the package got lost? What if someone else stole it along the way? What if the museum threw it out, not realizing its significance? But I reassured myself that it was the best I could do. At least now, the artifact had a chance of returning to where it belonged. A couple of weeks passed, and I heard nothing. No news stories about a miraculous return of a stolen figurine. No updates from anyone at the museum. Not that I'd given them any means to contact me. Silence. And honestly, that's probably for the best. Most museums handle thousands of items, and for all I know, they might have a backlog of artifacts waiting to be cataloged. Or maybe they recognized it, matched it to their records, and quietly placed it back in storage or on display. The important thing was that it wasn't in my drawer anymore, hidden away from public view. People sometimes ask me, do you wish you had turned it in earlier? Of course I do. Looking back, I see that a lot of my fears were exaggerated by my childish imagination. Even if the museum staff had been upset, it's unlikely they would have brought the full force of the law down on a 7- or 8-year-old who confessed to a silly mistake. Had I returned it quickly, maybe with my parents' help, the entire situation would have been resolved with far less drama. But childhood logic doesn't always align with adult common sense, and by the time I was old enough to see that, too much time had passed, and the fear had settled in. Some people also wonder why the museum let kids handle such a valuable item in the first place. In hindsight, that seems like a questionable policy. Possibly they never intended for the figurine to be circulated freely, or maybe they believed kids would be too intimidated or supervised to do anything rash. Mistakes happen. Regardless, the burden of guilt ultimately fell on me for taking something that wasn't mine. In reflecting on the entire saga, I realized it taught me some valuable lessons about conscience and responsibility. Even a small act of theft, or what might seem small to a child, can snowball into years of guilt and anxiety. It's a reminder that our actions have consequences, sometimes far beyond what we anticipate in the moment. I also learned that honesty, while scary in the short term, is almost always the better path in the long run. For years, I worried that someone would eventually knock on my door, brandishing a long-lost museum inventory sheet and connecting the dots. That never happened, of course, but the anxiety was real. By returning the figurine, I freed myself from a self-imposed psychological prison. Could it have turned out differently? Sure, but at least now I can finally say I did the right thing, even if it was decades late. Occasionally, I find myself daydreaming about what's happened to that figurine since I mailed it back. Maybe it's sitting on a desk in the museum's conservation lab, being meticulously cleaned and cataloged. Maybe it's on display with a small plaque that reads something like, Faience Figurine of Tauret. Maybe it's in storage, nestled among other artifacts waiting for their turn in the spotlight. Whatever its fate, I like to think it's better off in the museum's care than gathering dust in my home. I've never told my parents or close friends about this, mostly because I'm still a bit embarrassed that I kept it secret for so long. The only reason I opened up online was to get perspectives from strangers who wouldn't judge me on a personal level but could offer moral insight. They did, and that final push helped me do what I should have done years ago. Strangely enough, I feel a sense of gratitude toward the figurine, too. In a weird way, it became a symbol of personal growth. The childhood me who grabbed it on a whim was impulsive and innocent, not truly grasping the magnitude of her act. The adult me who finally let it go was able to make a decision grounded in a clearer sense of ethics. That journey between those 2 points in time is the story of a person learning how to handle guilt, how to confront a mistake, and how to seek redemption, even when it seems too late. If anyone reading this is in a similar predicament, maybe not with a priceless artifact, but with any unresolved wrongdoing, take it from me. There is power in setting things right. You might be scared of the fallout, but in many cases, the relief of cleansing your conscience far outweighs the risk. Plus, you never know how forgiving or understanding people might be, especially when it comes to a childhood error. I sometimes imagine a scene where a museum curator opens the package I sent. Inside, they find that little goddess Figurine, wrapped in bubble wrap. They read my note, which says something like, "This belongs in your collection. I took it as a child, and am now returning it anonymously." I imagine them feeling a mix of curiosity and relief. Perhaps they check a database, realize it matches a missing item from decades ago, and experience a small thrill that this piece of history has found its way home. That mental image warms my heart, because it suggests a full circle, a resolution to a story that started when I was too young to comprehend the consequences. In conclusion, my confession is both simple and extraordinary. I was a child who stole an ancient Egyptian artifact, lived with the guilt for nearly 25 years, and finally returned it anonymously as an adult. This journey taught me about the weight of conscience, the importance of atonement, and the complicated nature of childhood impulses. It also underscored how a single split-second decision can echo through one's life, shaping fears, regrets, and ultimately a path to redemption. Today, I breathe a lot easier. The figurine is no longer hidden in some drawer. It's presumably in the place it was always meant to be. I may never get confirmation of its exact fate, but I'm at peace with that. What matters is that I righted my wrong to the best of my ability. And for the first time since I was 7 or 8, I don't feel that gnawing pit of guilt whenever I think about museums, ancient Egypt, or the concept of stolen treasures. It's a quiet relief, one that reminds me how powerful a sense of closure can be. Maybe, if there's a message in all of this, it's that even the smallest choices we make can carry profound consequences. But also, it's never too late to do the right thing. No matter how much time has passed, owning up to our mistakes, or at least rectifying them in some way, can set us free from a burden we might not even realize we're carrying. As for the little greenish-blue goddess with the hippo's head, she's back where she belongs, and I've finally found the peace I needed.